So today I'm going to talk to you about how we use this tiny, tiny organism, duckweed, you can see it at the bottom here, to produce biodiesel. Now, we're not actually directly producing biodiesel. We're producing a compound called triacylglycerol, which basically looks like 3 diesel molecules joined together. So when I say tag or triacylglycerol, that's basically a substitute for diesel. It's then processed into diesel. So plant fats can actually be used to directly fuel diesel engines. And typically plants have high fat content in their seeds, storing for the next generation, but low in their mature tissues. And when we use biodiesel, you might be wondering, why are we using a carbon fuel source? And I have an answer for you. It's because we actually get the carbon from the atmosphere rather than releasing it from below the ground. So it's both renewable and it has much lower net carbon emissions than normal fuel. And finally, we can use the same equipment, so we don't need to adapt equipment. So where does all this biodiesel come from? It comes from these various organisms known as feedstocks. And there's one thing you'll notice about all these organisms is they all grow on the land. And feedstocks are the major limitation for implementing biofuels today. Throughout the world, about 80 billion liters per year of total biofuel are produced. That includes bioethanol and biodiesel. North America produces about half of that. And the main organisms we use are corn and soybean. Elsewhere, they sometimes use animal fat as well. But this is the major limiting factor, because if you'll notice, the vast majority of these plants are food. So that brings me to duckweed, which is a small flowering aquatic plant. There are 5 genuses with 37 species, and you can see representatives from the 5 species next to a quarter right there to scale. They range from like a millimeter to about a centimeter in size, so they're very, very small. And they grow on slow-moving fresh water, and they're very tolerant to high concentrations of nutrients, which would otherwise kill a lot of other plants. So that includes fertilizer runoff and wastewater. So you can grow these plants on wastewater, and it would not take away from land which would otherwise be used to grow food. And they grow very, very quickly. Their stated doubling time by mass is about 1.5 to 4.5 days, but it's been seen that they double in mass in just 16 hours under certain circumstances. So we can actually obtain a lot of biodiesel from these plants very, very quickly. And this is just for trivia purposes. This is one of the smallest flowers in the world of all plants. And as you can see, it doesn't have petals, but it has all of the sexual machinery of a flower. And this is also for trivia purposes, but I find this very interesting. And the exact same family as this plant is the largest flowering plant in the world, which is approximately 6 feet tall. This is Titan Eren, also known as the corpse flower. And I just think it's very funny to compare them side by side. Oh, and for reference, across the anther there is about a millimeter or less. So, why duckweed? Why are we using it for biofuel? Well, as I've stated, it doesn't compete with food crops for land. It has a high growth rate. It's tolerant to wastewater conditions. And early analysis on how much fat duckweed typically has it indicates that it's much higher than most other plants in mature tissues. So maybe we have to change it less than we would otherwise change other plants. And this is actually taken on campus. It's the most ducks I've ever seen in a row down on a pond on Bungtown Road down there. And they're frolicking in the duckweed. So when I'm talking about an exponential growth rate, a doubling time, this is Lake Oneida. And this is just for reference. This is 3 days, 3 days, 3 days. So once you fill it, you only need 3 days to get from here to here. So the difference between those 2 steps is a large amount of mass, a large amount of duckweed. But there are limitations. There's a big asterisk here. Because if there weren't, you would see duckweed eventually fill up the whole world. And so it's totally dependent on how much space you have and how many nutrients you have. So, so I have a big asterisk next to exponential because it's limited by space and by nutrients primarily. However, the point of this is that duckweed is scalable. You can introduce it to an environment to grow for biodiesel, and it doesn't matter how big that environment is, it will fill it up in due time. And so with fertilizer runoff, actually they use excess fertilizer because it's very easy for the nutrients in fertilizer to seep through the soil and go into the rivers. Particularly nitrates are notorious for this. So in these rivers we can grow the duckweed and beat the contaminated excess fertilizer water before it gets to the river deltas. And in the Gulf of Mexico, actually, where this fertilizer runoff accumulates ultimately, it grows giant algal blooms, which create like mats of algae, and it kills all of the fish. So maybe we can beat that process on the rivers feeding to the Gulf of Mexico. And so ultimately what we're manipulating is the metabolism of the duckweed. So in the Martienssen lab, we're actually trying to produce this endpoint fat, which is very, very similar to diesel. It's kind of like 3 diesel molecules combined together. And so it does need to be processed into biodiesel, but it's the ultimate goal is to produce this fat. There are enzymes which produce the fat from other fats and which break it down into other fats. So from both sides, we're trying to make the enzymes that produce more of it highly expressed and make the enzymes that break it down silenced. So we're actually using CRISPR to do this. This might be familiar to you. This is Cas9, and it's basically a pair of genetic scissors. It introduces specifically, according to the RNA there, it matches the RNA to DNA and then introduces a double-stranded break in the DNA, which results in a 1 to 3 base pair deletion, usually, maybe an insertion. But it ultimately disrupts the gene of interest. So this is how we're getting rid of the enzymes that break triacylglycerol down, and we have other mechanisms for building up the ones that increase it. So we've taken this approach from all angles to try and increase how fat these plants are. And in the future, we're going to need to develop better methods for processing and collecting all of the triacylglycerol and turning it into biodiesel. So in terms of technology, we are in the infancy of this project, but eventually we'll have duckweed that can grow almost anywhere, mostly limited by moisture and temperature. And so I would like to thank Team Duckweed. This is the original Team Duckweed, and my large lab, because without them, none of this would be possible.